Protean items are a staple of RuneScape 3. With the first one being added in 2013, they were earned through MTX means and award players with high amounts of XP, making them desirable items to have when you want to train your skills. This has been part of a mentality that has permeated RuneScape 3, and one of the major excuses Jagex has given time and time again as to why Treasure Enter exists and why it awards XP. In this video I want to take a look not necessarily to protein items themselves, but rather the type of mentality they represent. As you've been able to gather from the intro, protein items are items you earn from Treasure Enter by putting money in the game. You are able to earn skilling items where not only do you not need to spend any supplies outside of the protein item, they also provide high amounts of XP. Nowadays these items can actually be earned through in-game seasonal events, as almost every seasonal event involves a currency. We'll have a shop with extra rewards you can get, one of them being protein items. The other items that you can gain from both Treasure Enter and currency events are items that give out straight XP, such as lamps or stars, or they give out some other benefits such as training dummies for combat XP, divine locations which give out resources, springs, magic notepaper, engineering token boxes, GP bags, minigame enhancers, etc. When looking at all of these rewards, they all have one thing in common. They are OP items that usually skip or help skip unpleasant or undesired grinds. That's the main point of the protein items, it's to help players skip the boring levels straight to the most interesting parts of the game, and that goes for pretty much every item I talked about. Making the bridge with what I previously established, protein items, as well as all other items I've named, serve the function of not being a reward for the content you do, but rather being a way of skipping the content that players don't like. Have you ever seen any RuneScape 3 series where the content creators will quote-unquote skip the early game the best they can so they can get to the quote-unquote good parts, which is usually the endgame PVM bossing? Well, that's exactly the purpose that these items serve. They exist to help players skip to the parts of the game that they enjoy from parts of the game they don't like. This mentality is prevalent throughout RuneScape 3. While I am mentioning microtransactions and protein items here as an example, they are the symptom, not the cause, so much so that things like dailies are also reflective of this mentality. D&Ds are usually time-gated pieces of content that award stupid amounts of XP. This is where the term daily escape is mostly applied when talking about the dailies that RuneScape 3 has. The reason for these dailies being so prevalent is, again, wanting to skip the boring content to the fun endgame content. In my opinion, there is an argument to be made that early game content isn't unfun, it's simply unpolished and oftentimes overlooked, which is why one of the main points of a response I did a few weeks ago was that yes, reworking content is good. Overall, the mentality of wanting to skip quote-unquote boring parts of the game to me paints a better picture that there is a problem with the lack of options, or the options not being useful or satisfactory, rather than the early game of RuneScape simply being bad. I find that argument to be quite reductive, as I don't necessarily believe that RuneScape, especially the early game, is bad at all. In most MMORPGs, usually when players tend to use the argument of it gets good after 100 hours, we are talking about MMORPGs that have a heavy in-game focus and in-game player base, which led them to neglect how important the beginning parts also are. This is kind of what's happening here. This mentality, however, is obviously hurtful for the longevity of the game. Newer players get an increasingly shitty experience due to the lack of care of the early game as time goes on, while in-game players get all of the content. While this is good for the short term as you keep the in-game players hooked, for the long term it's actually pretty harmful because you don't really have a lot of new players coming into the game or sticking around when they do. So, to summarize, RuneScape 3 looks at boring and unfun grinds and creates a way for you to skip them or grind them faster. Old school RuneScape looks at boring or unfun grinds and addresses what makes them boring or unfun, while also creating choices for players to engage with said grind in different ways. In order to best demonstrate what I mean, let's grab some examples. Let's take everyone's favorite skill, agility. If we set the same time frame, so 2013, which is when old school RuneScape was released, to now, RuneScape 3 has had two major agility updates, Protean's agility course and the Necronia agility course. Compared to old school RuneScape in the same time frame, we got Protean's agility course, Chasey and Rooftop courses altogether, which were originally made up of 9 different courses, Allowed Sepulchre, a minigame that offers exclusive rewards, and Underwater Agility. So comparatively, old school RuneScape got more than double the amount of courses, although I do acknowledge that Anachronia is actually 3 separate courses altogether, while also getting a neat minigame with extra rewards and an underwater method to go with it. Now, why is it that old school RuneScape got so many more agility updates compared to RuneScape 3? Well, the answer is actually fairly simple. Silver Rock Boots. These boots, when loaded with feathers, will award you agility XP while training other skills. Yep, that's right, you don't need to engage with agility to train it in RuneScape 3. As a result, well, why should the game get agility updates? They are pointless because all of them would be worse than Silver Rock Boots. Since these boots work on other skills, agility is essentially 0 time in RuneScape 3. Therefore, whenever someone brings up the fact that agility should probably be given more content so players have more options to engage with it, it gets shot down because it doesn't need to. I briefly touched on this when I made my response video, and I think that if you haven't seen it, the video can actually be a good companion to this one. But to summarize, the mentality of not needing something is bad because content shouldn't come into the game depending on the necessity of players, but rather depending on the choices you can give them. So even though most people will stick with Silver Rock Boots, it's still important to give players options on how to engage with skill with different rewards, especially because Silver Rock Boots are not available for Iron Man. So this type of accounts, which, most of the times actually get chosen to play since they don't get the allure of MTX or Treasure Enter, because Iron Man cannot use it, get locked out of major way of training the skill without any content to replace it. Instead, let's look at old school RuneScape yet again. Crafting for Iron Man had a meta of going to charter ships, buying soda ash and buckets of sand, blowing glass and hopping worlds. As a result, Jagex introduced a farmable seaweed, which is a good source to obtain soda ash, as well as using the quarry in the desert, which was mostly just used by high efficiency players trying to 3-tick and get high XP rates, and allowed Irons to exchange the mined sandstone for buckets of sand. So to recap, we had a skill that didn't give people many options, and instead of Jagex skipping it with an item that you can get charges for with microtransactions, added options for players so that they would have more methods and choices when training this skill. This overall gives skills depthness as well as making grinds overall more enjoyable, or at least more tolerable. While agility is still not very liked in RuneScape, it has come a long way from the old days where everyone hated it. This goes for other skills as well, liked or hated, and it's simply a staple of old school RuneScape. In RuneScape 3, on the other hand, what we see is more protein items for different skills being introduced. Proteins you mostly get from microtransactions that give you a bunch of XP and an excuse to not engage with the skill at all. Funnily enough, while I was working on this video, Jagex added yet more protein items. I guess they are really good at proving my points. And items aren't the only thing either. Earlier I mentioned D&Ds, and probably the most notorious one are Gothics in caches. This is a minigame that spawns every hour that you can do twice a day. They award stupid amounts of divination XP. This is how most people train early divination given how good the XP actually is. This, however, discourages people from taking part in the skill, and even though the skill has been in the game for 12 years, the early parts of it still feel as bland and boring as when the skill was first released. So in this example, instead of giving you an item, Jagex instead makes a time-gated minigame that showers you with XP while serving the same purpose of skipping what players would call a boring grind. The conclusion here is the same, awarding players XP instead of fixing the root causes of why players even find it boring to begin with. As a whole, the problem is clear. RuneScape 3 prioritizes skipping content, or at least making that content go faster. This usually results in early game content being forgotten, becoming unpolished, and players not having many choices to avoid them. This makes for an unfun and annoying experience, which makes players want to skip this content, creating a negative feedback loop where Jagex introduces methods to skip boring grinds, content gets forgotten, becomes worse over time, there are no options added, making players wish Jagex added ways to skip this grind, and so on. My issue here is that, for the most part, polishing content or creating options doesn't need to be an entire ordeal. When we look at the examples of the sandstone, for example, this is one NPC in the quarry that trades your buckets for sand. We are not talking about an entire expansion. Unfortunately, RuneScape 3 has had this bad habit in these past few years, where content just needs to come in sort of a complete form. So instead of just adding tiny bits here and there as you go, they usually save everything to add in one huge update. This is bad because the point of these little content updates is that they are small and can most of the times be almost perceived as quality of life due to how small they are. You don't need to have a huge expansion to introduce them. To be fair, they have slowly, over time, especially in these past few years, added a lot of skilling content. The issue I have with it is, just as I was talking about earlier, you need huge expansions to introduce them. This leads to most skilling content just being overpowered and outshining everything else that came before it. In a way, these updates, because they are tied to new shiny expansions, don't create depthness to the skill, but instead change the meta and eclipse everything that came before it, which is something RuneScape 3 does a lot. They are, however, at least trying, and I think that should be celebrated. I do still think they should just have more smaller updates rather than having entire different training methods and huge expansions, and should look into things just offering different rewards as opposed to simply showering you with more XP than before. Honestly, just copy what old school RuneScape is doing at this point. They already laid the groundwork. The solutions here are pretty obvious, which is why I call this chapter the obvious. Remove Treasure Hunter. Why is it still in the game? How can Jagex just give the excuse that some players just don't like the grind, so they should pay for XP and GP? Yeah, no, that type of player exploitation should never be tolerated. I'm not gonna go overboard and ask for the removal of protein items and whatnot, but people should seriously start thinking how they engage with the game, because I don't think their existence does any good for the longevity of it. Focus on smaller updates that are used to just solve little grievances that players have with certain training methods, polishing them and adding little things here and there. You don't need a full-on expansion, nor do you need to spend months worth of resources to make some of these changes. As a result, slowly the game will become better over time. I seriously think that if Jagex were to focus 1 year just on smaller updates to iron out the game, and add just different tiny rewards and methods to the game, that it would become a much better game. Sure, late game players would cry 24/7 that they don't get new content, but honestly, if you want to save the ship, you have to fix the holes so it stays afloat. While I have been focusing on the mentality in RuneScape 3, and while this might seem directed at players, it's not. I have my grievances with RuneScape 3 players and the way some people interact with the game, as well as some opinions over it. However, the fault here is Jagex's. Not only do they neglect important parts of the game, but also keep pushing and focusing on Treasure Hunter. People that buy keys and fall for a predatory system aren't the problem. The problem is the system existing in the first place and being designed exactly to be predatory, while Jagex uses it as an excuse that players simply want to skip parts of the game. And the problem with the mentality over skipping content is exactly the same. Jagex knows better than players here. People are paying to play the game. It isn't their job to design the content, but I do feel that Jagex simply neglects these types of content. And it's getting worse. When Hero Pass was around, you could buy a bag with currency from the event. This bag had your typical Dungeoneering token boxes, modified gifts, but it also had stuff like Unstable Air Runes, which is an item that gives runespan points. It had Chimes and Taijitu, which is a currency to unlock rewards at the Arc, and it had Strange and Golden Rocks. These rocks are used to build statues. You need X amount of statues for the Comp Cape. this currency could be bought with money, meaning this is no longer about making the XP progress faster for those that don't have the time to catch up, it's about doing that for every single piece of content in the game. Until Jagex stops pushing this, they won't ever have a game that feels satisfactory to play long term. Any achievement is just a question of time until you can buy something to skip it or at least make it faster. There is at least an attempt by Jagex to keep introducing skilling methods and slowly polishing parts of the game over time, however, this is nowhere near enough. Not only do we need to outright cut or at least nerf items like proteins, we also need to add options and incentives for players to do these skills themselves and do these grinds. A lot of the polishing and additions I've been talking about have been pretty minor, but ultimately, details are what makes a game. But that's it for me. If you enjoyed the video, don't forget to subscribe, as I usually talk about the game and you will be able to see more content like this in the future.